Chapter 1. The Portrait's Midnight Gaze. The manor exhaled death the moment Evangeline crossed its threshold. Not the clean death of seasons turning, but something older, the kind that lingered in stone and shadow, in the spaces between heartbeats. She stood in the entrance hall of Raven's Hollow, her fingers still cold from the cemetery soil that had buried her grandmother 3 days prior. The inheritance letter crackled in her coat pocket, sealed with a wax sigil she didn't recognize. A crescent moon pierced by a single drop of blood. "The house has been sealed for 7 years," the solicitor had said, his voice thin with something approaching fear. "Your grandmother's wishes were explicit. No one enters until you come of age. No one touches the east wing. Should you wish to sell..." But Evangeline had already made her decision. She was 23, mute since birth, and the world had never known what to do with a woman who communicated through charcoal and canvas instead of words. Perhaps a decaying manor full of secrets would be kinder than the polished drawing rooms of London society, where her silence was treated as a defect to be cured, rather than simply who she was. The entrance hall towered 3 stories high, ringed by a gallery of ancestral portraits. Most were forgettable, stern-faced Ashworths in hunting dress, ladies in pearls and forced smiles. But one portrait arrested her completely. It hung in the upper gallery, positioned where moonlight from the stained glass window would find it at precise angles. A man, not young, but not ancient, perhaps 40, with the kind of ageless beauty that transcended mere years. Black hair swept back from a forehead marked with an old scar, eyes the color of winter starlight, and his expression. God, his expression held centuries of longing, compressed into a single, devastating glance. She knew this face. She had been drawing this face for 6 months without knowing why. Evangeline's breath caught. She pulled her leather satchel from her shoulder, fingers fumbling until she found her sketch pad. The most recent drawings lay on top. A dozen variations of the same man, captured from different angles, in different lights. Some showed him in profile, melancholy and distant. Others caught his face head-on, and in those she had drawn something desperate in his gaze, as if he were searching for her across an impossible distance. The signature on the portrait frame read, "Lysander Ashworth, 1643. But that was impossible. The clothing in the portrait belonged to the Restoration period, to an age of velvet and candlelight. The paint was too fresh, too vivid, and his eyes... She looked up at the portrait again, and her stomach lurched. He was looking directly at her. Not in the way portraits did, the trick of artist and perspective. No. His gaze tracked her movement. She stepped left, his eyes followed. She stepped right. He watched her with an intensity that burned. Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs. She forced herself to approach the portrait, ascending the curved staircase to the gallery. Her footsteps echoed on marble worn smooth by centuries of footfall. The house was cold, far colder than the autumn night justified. Her breath misted. Every candelabra she passed seemed to flicker despite the absence of wind. The portrait hung larger than she'd realized from the hall below. The frame was ornate obsidian, inlaid with silver crescents. The artist had captured something almost alive in the subject's face, a nobility twisted by suffering, beauty corrupted by knowledge of things mortal minds weren't meant to know. And his eyes. God, his eyes. They held her prisoner. In them she saw blood-stained marble, candlelight reflected in ancient glass, the taste of copper and ash. She saw centuries folded into a single moment. She saw a hand reaching toward her across a void that could never be crossed, and the anguish of a man who had loved and lost and loved again until love itself became a curse. Evangeline's hand rose unbidden, trembling. She pressed her palm against the canvas, against the painted silk of his sleeve, and the portrait moved. Not subtly. The movement was violent and real. The figure shifted, his hand rising to mirror hers, palm against palm through an invisible barrier. The expression that flickered across his face was so raw, so desperate, that she gasped without sound, her throat producing only that familiar hollow silence. His lips moved, forming words she could not hear. Evangeline. Then the midnight bell tolled from the village church 3 miles distant, its sound reaching the manor as if carried by something supernatural. The portrait froze. The man's hand fell. His eyes, that terrible winter starlight, went blank and distant again. Merely paint, merely canvas, merely the rendering of a long-dead ancestor. But she had seen. The moment before the clock finished striking 12, she had seen his lips shape her name. Evangeline staggered backward, her sketch pad falling to the floor. Pages scattered, a dozen drawings of him, each one a study in obsession she hadn't consciously understood until now. How had she known? How had her hand been guided to render the exact architecture of his sorrow, the precise angle of longing in his jaw? A sound came from the east wing, the sealed section of the manor. It was the groan of old wood, or perhaps a door shifting in its frame. Then, carried on air that had no visible source, the faintest scent, earth and copper and something ancient as tombs. Evangeline gathered her scattered pages with shaking fingers. The candles throughout the gallery had begun to burn lower, their flames bending away from something invisible moving through the air. A presence. Not threatening, but heavy. The weight of a consciousness that had waited centuries for this moment, that had watched her through a painted canvas and knew her soul the way one knows a lover's skin in darkness. She descended the stairs too quickly, her footsteps sharp and frantic. Behind her, she heard or felt the sound of movement in the upper gallery. Not pursuit, but acknowledgement. The stirring of something that had been sleeping in the portrait, waiting for her to finally come home. The entrance hall swallowed her. Moonlight through the stained glass cast colored shadows across the floor, crimsons and blacks that looked disturbingly like blood. Evangeline made her way toward what she hoped was a sitting room, any room where she might barricade herself until dawn. But as she reached for a door, she saw it, a handprint on the wood, still wet, still warm, pressed from the other side. It was gone when she blinked. In her satchel, her sketchbook burned against her hip like a living thing, filled with the face of a man who had spoken her name through painted lips at midnight. A man who had been waiting since 1643 for a girl who drew pictures of him without knowing why. Evangeline pressed her back against the wall and tried not to scream in the only way she knew how, through the violent shaking of her entire body. Outside, the midnight had become absolute. Somewhere in the manor, something ancient and beautiful and terribly hungry stirred awake. The hunt had begun. Chapter number 2. The Bloodline's Whisper. Sleep was impossible. Evangeline had barricaded herself in what the solicitor's notes called the Blue Drawing Room, a chamber that smelled of lavender sachets and old velvet, as if someone had sealed away the room's breath along with its ghosts. She sat rigid on a settee, her charcoal pencils spread across the mahogany table before her, every portable candle in the house clustered within arm's reach. The sketchbook lay open to her most recent drawing of him. In this one, she had captured something she couldn't explain. His hand reaching through darkness, not to harm, but to anchor. The longing in his expression was almost unbearable to look at. It suggested someone who had spent so long without touch, without tenderness, that human connection had become a theoretical concept, something learned from books rather than lived in bone and blood. She had drawn this 3 months ago, 3 months before receiving the inheritance letter, 3 months before coming to Ravenshollow. The candles flickered in unison, though no draft moved through the sealed room. Evangeline's hand instinctively reached for her pad, fingers positioning themselves over fresh paper. She had learned long ago that her sketching wasn't entirely voluntary. Sometimes her hand moved of its own accord, possessed by visions she didn't consciously understand. Her grandmother had called it the gift. The specialists in London had called it hysterical drawing, a symptom of her mutism. But as her charcoal touched paper, Evangeline realized what was happening. This wasn't her hand at all. The lines appeared without her volition, her arm moving in patterns unfamiliar and fluid. A scene emerged, a great hall, torches burning blue-green. a circle drawn in what looked disturbingly like blood. Figures in robes, their faces obscured. And at the center, a younger version of the man from the portrait, his hands bound with silver chains, his head thrown back as if in ecstasy or agony, the distinction unclear. Beneath the scene, words appeared in handwriting that was not hers. The Covenant of Shadows, sealed in blood, 1643. The Ashworth line bound to the darkness eternal. No redemption, only longing, only her. Evangeline jerked her hand back as if burned. The pencil clattered to the floor. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat painful, irregular. This was beyond sketching visions. This was possession. This was a presence so vast and conscious that it could move her limbs, could write prophecy through her fingers. A knock came at the door, soft, courteous, impossibly civilized for whatever supernatural thing stalked this manor. Evangeline's breath caught. She remained motionless, but the knock came again, more insistent. The door was locked. She had turned the key herself, but that seemed a fragile thing against whatever waited outside. She rose slowly, drawn toward the threshold as if connected by invisible threads. Her hand extended unbidden and turned the lock. The corridor beyond was lit by a single candelabra that certainly had not been burning moments before. In its light she saw him, not the man from the portrait, not exactly. This version was younger, dressed in a shirt of dark linen, open at the throat, breeches of expensive cloth. His scar was visible in this light, a thin line bisecting his left eyebrow, and his eyes, the same winter starlight, but now containing movement, consciousness, a soul that had been compressed into canvas for far too long. He stood perhaps 6 feet from her doorway, maintaining distance as if the space between them were holy ground he dared not violate. His hands were visible and empty, held slightly away from his body in a gesture of supplication. When he spoke, his voice was silk and sorrow, accented in a way that belonged to centuries past. You came. Evangeline opened her mouth. A reflex, though she knew nothing would emerge but silence. He watched her, and something in his expression softened with profound sadness, as if her muteness was a grief he had long anticipated and accepted. Forgive me, he continued. I should not have moved the portrait, should not have reached across the boundaries we established. But Evangeline, the Evangelines before you, they lasted only decades, lives cut short. And you, he paused, his jaw tightening. You lived longer, lived enough to find your way back to me, each time, each iteration drawn closer to the truth. She stepped into the corridor, compelled by something deeper than fear or caution. Her hands moved before her mind could catch up, forming shapes in the air, the language of her silence, the sign language she had perfected over 2 decades. Who are you? His smile was tragic. Lysander Ashworth, also called the Fallen, the Damned, the Bound One. I have had many names, Evangeline. None of them matter now. Only yours ever mattered. He reached into his shirt and withdrew a locket, old silver worked into the shape of a crescent. He pressed it toward her, not touching her skin, but extending it as offering, as prayer. Your grandmother kept this, as did your mother before her, as did the first Evangeline in 1643, on the night she chose to bind herself to my darkness, rather than let me face damnation alone. Evangeline's hand trembled as she accepted the locket. Inside was a portrait miniature, not Lysander, but a young woman with her own eyes, her own mouth, her own expression of quiet defiance, and beneath the miniature words in spidery script, to my eternal beloved, death cannot sever what blood has joined. E. The year inscribed below was 1643. The covenant was meant to damn us both, Lysander whispered. Blood magic of the deepest kind. A woman who loved a monster enough to share his curse. They did not expect her bloodline to survive it. They did not expect the gift to pass through centuries, mother to daughter, daughter to granddaughter. Each Evangeline inheriting fragments of the blood memory, the psychic imprint of her ancestors' choice. Evangeline's vision blurred. She looked up at him, truly looked, and saw the weight of 4 centuries written in every line of his face. She saw a man who had loved and lost the same woman over and over across generations, never able to break the curse that kept resurrecting her in his life, only to steal her away. Her hands rose again, moving in desperate shapes. How many? 7, he said quietly. 7 Evangelines. 7 times I thought I could protect you from the darkness in my blood. 7 times I failed. The first lived 40 years before the curse caught up with her. The last... His voice broke. The last was your mother. She lived only 31 years before the vampire hunter found us both. Evangeline felt the knowledge settle into her bones like she had always known it, like this was simply memory surfacing rather than impossible revelation. The sketches, the visions, the way she had always drawn his face with the weight of centuries in his eyes. She had been remembering. The blood memory Lysander spoke of, inherited through generations of women born to love an immortal man. I have kept the portraits, Lysander continued, one for each of you, bound my consciousness to the canvas so that when you came of age, you would know, so that when you inherited Raven's Hollow, you would understand what waits in the sealed east wing. He stepped closer, and she could smell him now, earth and copper and something like incense, like candles burned in crypts, not threatening, familiar in a way that made her chest ache. The curse can be broken, Evangeline, he whispered, but the price is what it has always been. Another blood covenant, another sacrifice, another woman foolish enough to love a monster. He extended his hand, palm upward, waiting for her to choose. Outside, the midnight bells began to toll. Chapter 3. The Immortal Stranger. She did not take his hand. Instead, Evangeline backed away into the blue drawing room and locked the door again, pressing her spine against the wood as if that fragile barrier could hold back the tide of impossible truth. Lysander did not follow. She heard his footsteps retreat down the corridor, heard the distant sound of a door closing, not with anger, but with the patient resignation of someone accustomed to rejection across centuries. The locket remained clenched in her fist, warm as blood. Evangeline did not sleep. Instead, she spent the hours before dawn, sketching, not from vision this time, but from the fractured knowledge burning in her veins. She drew the original Evangeline, 1643, finding the woman's face in her own memory as clearly as if she had lived it. She drew the ritual scene again, this time with clarity. Lysander bound and bleeding, offering his darkness like a sacrament. She drew the 7 Evangelines in profile, a procession of the same face, aging, loving, dying, being reborn. When gray dawn light crept through the curtains, she had filled 20 pages, and each one answered the question she couldn't ask aloud. How does a woman choose between the man she's loved across lifetimes and the self-preservation every living creature possessed? The morning brought a curious silence to Raven's Hollow. No creaking floorboards, no sense of presence. The manor felt inhabited only by sunlight and dust, as if Lysander had receded entirely, honoring the boundary she had erected. She found servants' quarters in the depths of the kitchen, ancient coal stoves and a pantry well stocked enough for weeks. Someone had left them recently. The supplies were fresh, though there was no note, no explanation of who had maintained this empty house. She ate mechanically, her mind elsewhere. By noon, she had made a decision. If Lysander Ashworth was real, if the blood memory was real, the covenant real, the 7 dead Evangelines real, then remaining locked in ignorance was its own form of death. Better to face the dark, better to understand than to exist suspended in the liminal space between belief and denial. She bathed and dressed with care, choosing a deep green velvet dress from a wardrobe in the master bedroom, apparently prepared for her arrival, in her size, in her taste. Whoever had maintained Raven's Hollow had understood her needs entirely. The thought should have been unsettling. Instead, it felt like coming home. As evening descended, she made her way toward the east wing. The sealed door was ancient oak, reinforced with iron, marked with symbols she recognized from her sketches. Protective runes, binding sigils, the circular mark that meant covenant. Her hand moved without conscious thought, tracing the symbols in reverse order, undoing them. With each touch, she felt the wards crumble. By the time she reached for the lock, it swung open without resistance. The east wing exhaled stale air and incense, the accumulated smell of centuries sealed away from the living world. Evangeline's candle illuminated a long corridor lined with portraits, dozens of them, each bearing a woman's face. She recognized them, 7 Evangelines and their descendants, the daughters of her bloodline spanning back to 1643. And at the end of the corridor, a door of polished black wood, she found him not inside but in the chamber beyond, a vast circular room with a vaulted ceiling painted with stars in configurations that seemed to shift and rearrange as she watched. Candles burned everywhere, hundreds of them, arranged in precise patterns on the floor. And at the center, surrounded by the candlelight like a supplicant awaiting judgment, was Lysander. He wore formal attire from the Restoration period, doublet and coat of midnight blue, embroidered with silver crescents. His hair was pulled back with a black ribbon, and his expression, when he turned to face her, held such terrible longing that Evangeline nearly wept with the weight of it. "You came," he said again, the same words from the corridor, but now laden with different meaning. Not surprise, gratitude, relief that his patience across 4 centuries had finally borne fruit. He did not approach. He remained ringed by candlelight, as if he dared not step outside the circle that bound him. Evangeline understood. This was the covenant space, the place where blood magic had once bound him and his first love together. He was still bound here, still trapped, still waiting for the choice that could free or doom them both. She moved deeper into the chamber, and with each step, she felt the blood memory strengthen. Fragments of Evangeline 1643's experience flashed through her mind. The taste of Lysander's mouth, the burn of vampire bite, the ecstasy and agony of accepting his darkness into her veins. She felt her ancestors' love like a living thing, vast and desperate, and entirely willing to embrace damnation for one more moment in his arms. Evangeline raised her hands and signed, "Tell me the truth. What happens if I covenant with you?" Lysander's jaw clenched. "You inherit my curse. You would remain ageless for a time, perhaps a century, perhaps 2. We would have moments, Evangeline. Real moments. A life together. But eventually the blood bond would degrade. Your immortality would burn away like paper in flame, and when you died, the curse would reset, and you would be reborn into the world, and I would wait again, hoping you would find your way back to me." He paused, and his voice dropped to something barely audible. "And each time, you would suffer less and less from loving me. Each iteration, your compassion would erode. The 7th Evangeline, your mother, she wept when she learned what you would become. She begged me to let the bloodline end, but I couldn't. I was too selfish, too desperate for her face in another woman's eyes." Evangeline felt the truth of it resonate in her bones. She understood her mother's sorrow, inherited through blood memory. She understood the terrible mathematics of immortal love, the way caring for someone became its own curse when time itself became the enemy. She raised her hands again. "And if I refuse?" "Then I remain bound," Lysander said quietly. "And when you die, the bloodline ends, the covenant shatters. I will finally, truly die. No more waiting, no more resurrection. Rest at last." He looked directly at her then, and his expression held something like peace. "Perhaps that would be mercy, Evangeline. Perhaps you refusing would be the kindest thing any of your incarnations could do for me." She realized then that he meant it. He would accept either path with the same devastating grace. He would love her enough to let her save him through rejection, or love her enough to curse her with his darkness forever. It was perhaps the most romantic thing anyone had ever offered her, and it terrified her completely. Chapter 4. The First Blood. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended state. Evangeline remained in the East Wing, though not in Lysander's presence. She had demanded, through frantic gestures and sketched demands, to understand the covenant fully before making any choice that could bind her to immortality. Lysander provided her with a library of texts, grimoires bound in leather that smelled of copper, personal journals spanning centuries, and most crucially, the original blood covenant written in Evangeline 1643's own hand. The handwriting was exquisite and entirely her own, nothing like the possession that had moved Evangeline's hand in the blue drawing room. But the words themselves spoke of a choice made not in desperation, but in full, terrible clarity. I am writing this on the eve of the covenant, knowing what comes next. Lysander has explained every consequence, every cost. I choose him not because I cannot live without him. I am no fragile thing, despite what society insists women are. I choose him because in 400 years, when I am dust and he remains, I want him to know that my choice was mine alone. Not coercion, not desperation, love, pure and conscious and willing to destroy my own mortality for one more breath in his presence. The pages that followed detailed the ritual itself, how they had met in secret, how the vampire hunters had driven them to this choice as the only way to remain together without being hunted across the earth. How Lysander's bite, far from being savage, had been almost gentle. How the exchange of blood had felt like being unmade and remade into something new, something that could exist in both his world and the mortal one. And then, on the final page, something that made Evangeline's breath catch. I write this final entry knowing I am changing. The hunger is becoming part of me. Not the hunger to feed on blood, but to be near him, to touch him without the barrier of fear between us. Within a month, I will be transformed entirely. I will be as he is, bound to darkness, blessed by moonlight, cursed with immortality. But Lysander says that when our generation is long dead, when our names are forgotten, the blood memory will persist. Our descendants will carry echoes of what we became, and perhaps one of them will find their way back to him. Perhaps the covenant was never meant to end with me alone. Perhaps it was meant to echo through eternity. The journal cut off there. No final date, no explanation. But Evangeline understood. Evangeline 1643 had transformed into something other than human. She had become what Lysander was. And then, that same night, the hunger came for her. It began as a subtle ache in her teeth, a sensitivity to light and sound that made the candles burn almost unbearably bright. Evangeline had locked herself in a small chamber off the library, a room with no mirrors. She couldn't bear to see her own transformation written across her face. By the second night, her skin burned from the inside out, as if fever lived in her very blood. She knew somehow what was happening. The blood memory she had inherited was not passive, it was active, waiting. It had needed only her presence in Ravenshollow, only her acceptance of the East Wing, only her reading of the Covenant to fully activate. The curse, or gift, or both, it was transforming her whether she had consciously chosen it or not. On the third night, as midnight approached, she heard Lysander's voice through the locked door. "The hunger has started," he said quietly. "I feel it. Your blood calling to mine. This happens to all the Evangelines eventually. It is the covenant awakening in your veins." She could barely think through the pain. It felt like drowning in fire, like something massive was being born inside her. She managed to shuffle to the door and unlock it, and Lysander entered, carefully, as if she were something precious that might shatter. He looked at her with absolute compassion, and without asking, he drew a dagger from his coat, silver blade catching candlelight, and drew it swiftly across his own wrist. Blood welled up, dark as wine, steaming in the cold air of the chamber. He extended his arm toward her. "Drink," he whispered. "Let me ease this transition. This is what the first Evangeline begged for by the end. Not conversation, but connection through blood. This is what your body needs." She should have been revolted. Every mortal instinct should have recoiled. Instead, she found herself drawn to him, her lips parting, her entire being focused on that single wrist. The hunger that had been tearing her apart crystallized into a singular need. him in whatever form he offered. When she tasted his blood, the world inverted. The experience wasn't savage. It was intimate, profound, everything she had ever desired without knowing it. His blood tasted of earth and time, of centuries of nights under moonlight, of a sorrow so deep it was almost sweet. And as she drank, the pain in her body transmuted into something else. Not pleasure, but release, like touching something holy. She felt, rather than heard, the blood memory of her ancestor activate fully. She experienced Evangeline 1643's first feeding, felt her ancestor's astonishment as the hunger transformed into something transcendent. And she felt Lysander, not just the present moment of him, but all of his past, flooding into her consciousness. 4 centuries of waiting, 4 centuries of love and loss, 4 centuries of watching the same woman die and be reborn and die again. When she finally pulled away, gasping, Evangeline saw herself in Lysander's eyes and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her skin had taken on a luminescence, pale as pearl. Her eyes had changed, the brown irises now ringed with silver, bright enough to see in complete darkness. When she touched her mouth, she felt the fangs, small, elegant, retracting smoothly into her gums. Not a monster's teeth, a predator's gift. Lysander wrapped her wrist with a cloth, allowing his own blood to seal, healing before her eyes. Then he opened his arms to her, an invitation, a question, a prayer. Evangeline moved into them like she was coming home after a lifetime of exile. She felt his arms close around her, felt the impossible cold of his body against hers, not the cold of death, but of something beyond mortal temperature entirely. She pressed her ear to his chest and heard no heartbeat, only the slow, eternal silence of a creature that had transcended the need for breath. "The covenant is awakening in you," Lysander whispered into her hair. "Soon you will feel its final binding, but for now, let yourself exist in this moment. You have chosen, Evangeline. Your body chose when your mind could not, and his voice broke slightly, I finally have you. Again. After so long." Outside the chamber, midnight bells began to toll, and in the space between heartbeats and bell chimes, Evangeline understood the terrible truth. She had never really had a choice at all. The blood memory, the inheritance, the sketches that had guided her hand, all of it had been the covenant working through centuries to bring her back to him. She had been bound before she was even born, tied to Lysander Ashworth through blood magic older than nations. But as his hand came up to gently touch her transformed face, as she felt the reality of him against her for the first time without the barrier of mortality between them, she realized she didn't mind. Some chains, she thought, were forged from love itself. Chapter 5. The Unraveling Past. The memories came in pieces, like a shattered mirror reassembling itself inside her skull. Evangeline spent the next 2 nights in the Covenant Chamber, learning the topography of her own mind as expanded by Lysander's blood. Every time she fed from him, and the hunger demanded feeding 3 times daily now, as her transformation deepened, she inherited not just sustenance but fragments of his consciousness. 400 years of memory cascaded through her like water through a broken dam. She saw the world of 1643 through his eyes, Cambridge in autumn, the smell of burning books, the religious fervor that had marked him as cursed from birth. He had been born Lysander Ashworth, youngest son of a noble family, marked even as an infant by an inexplicable birth defect, a scar that appeared on his brow without cause, as if his soul had been marked before his body was ever formed. By age 16, it became clear he was something other. The sun burned him. He craved raw meat. He moved with a predator's grace that terrified the servants. The family physician called it demonic possession. The local priest called it witchcraft. His father called it shame. "I was no true vampire then," Lysander had told her as they lay entwined in the darkness of the Covenant Chamber, his arm cradling her head. "I was something in between, a hybrid perhaps. My mother's bloodline carried the mark of old things, older magic, I was born half-cursed, waiting for the transformation that would complete me. The transformation came on his 23rd birthday, when vampire hunters caught him in a crypt where he'd been hiding from sunlight. They would have killed him, but Evangeline 1643 was there, their servant, supposedly, though she was actually his lover, meeting him in secret for months. The memory of it hit Evangeline like a physical blow. Evangeline 1643, stepping in front of the hunter's blade, not with heroic defiance, but with a kind of gentle inevitability. "I was always meant to bind myself to you," young Evangeline whispered as blood spilled from the wound. "The prophecy has been written in my blood since birth. Let me finish it." And when Lysander had refused, when he had tried to push her away, she had forced herself closer, pressed her wrist to his mouth, and begged him to complete what fate had begun. The blood covenant that followed was violent and transcendent. Young Evangeline had transformed not into a vampire, but into something new, a mortal-immortal hybrid, able to walk in daylight, but craving blood, able to age slowly, but not immortally. She had become the bridge between Lysander's dark world and the light. They had fled Cambridge. They had tried to make a life together across Europe, moving constantly, never settling, always pursued by hunters who sensed something unnatural in their union. And then, after 47 years of marriage, of learning each other's bodies and souls across half a century, Evangeline 1643 had begun to die. The aging curse that had held her at 30 for 50 years suddenly accelerated. In the space of 2 years, she transformed from youthful bride to ancient crone. Lysander, frozen at his own age, could only watch as the woman he loved deteriorated before him. The night she died, Evangeline experienced it as if she were there. Lysander had held her in his arms and felt her last breath against his chest. And in his despair, the curse had transformed her again. It had burned out what remained of her mortal flesh and forced her into true vampirehood, eternal life purchased at the price of her soul itself. But her consciousness had not survived the transformation. She had become an undead thing, still wearing Evangeline's face, but empty of everything that made her her. Lysander had spent 3 months with a living corpse, wearing his beloved's features, until the hunter who had pursued them found them both and put a stake through the creature's heart. The grief of that memory nearly destroyed Evangeline's new consciousness entirely. She wept blood tears against Lysander's chest, and he held her through the anguish of experiencing the death of her own ancestor through his eyes. "The covenant was flawed," Lysander whispered as she shook with sobs. "Created in desperation by 2 people trying to cheat death itself, the blood magic worked. It did make her immortal. But the spell was twisted. It burned away her soul in the transformation, left her a creature of hunger and instinct. I spent the next 200 years believing I had damned her eternally." Evangeline pulled back far enough to look at his face. She signed, her movements jerky with emotion. "But the other Evangelines were born through blood memory, not vampirehood," Lysander continued. "I realized, with the second one born in 1689, that the covenant wasn't meant to create more vampires. It was meant to resurrect Evangeline's soul, piece by piece, across multiple incarnations. Each Evangeline that was born carried fragments of the first one's consciousness, her memories, her love, her ability to cross between the mortal and immortal worlds. The curse was trying to heal itself through bloodline repetition." He rose and pulled her with him to stand before a mirror, the only one permitted in the East Wing, covered normally, now revealed. In it, Evangeline saw her transformation. No longer entirely human, but not fully vampire either. Her skin held an opalescent sheen. Her eyes glowed with borrowed starlight. She was the bridge between worlds, just as her ancestor had been. "Each Evangeline lived slightly longer than the one before," Lysander explained. "The first lasted 47 years in mortal form before the curse killed her. The second lived 60. The third, 75. Your mother—" His voice tightened. "Your mother lived 31 years in her transformed state before the hunters found us, but not before she taught your bloodline something crucial." He turned Evangeline away from the mirror and took her face between his hands. Your mother discovered that the covenant could be managed, not through vampirehood, but through deliberate, controlled feeding. If she fed from me regularly, but not excessively, she could maintain a balance, neither fully mortal nor fully undead. She believed that eventually the blood magic itself would stabilize, that the curse could be transformed into a gift. Evangeline felt hope and despair war inside her. She signed, "And will it?" Lysander's expression was honest in a way that broke her heart. "I don't know, but I know this. The covenant has been trying to resurrect your ancestor's soul for nearly 400 years. The fact that you inherited the gift, that you were drawn back to me despite all attempts to hide you, suggests the magic itself is becoming more refined, suggests that perhaps this time it might finally work. This time, the soul might truly return." He pulled her close again, and she felt the tremor run through him, not from fear or hunger, but from something like faith. "I have waited 400 years to have you back, Evangeline. And for the first time since the curse began, I believe that perhaps I might finally get to keep you." The midnight bells tolled again, and Evangeline understood. The transformation was deepening her connection to the covenant with each passing night. Soon there would be no distinction between her will and the blood magic's will. She would be bound completely, eternally, to the man she loved and the curse that had always been her birthright. The only question remaining was whether she could learn to call such chains by a different name. Chapter 6. Revelation of Darkness. By the seventh day, Evangeline could no longer deny the truth written across her own body. She had stopped eating mortal food entirely. The sight of the fresh bread the mysterious servants left in the east wing made her stomach revolt. Only blood satisfied the hunger now. Lysander's blood, offered freely from his wrist or throat, warming her from the inside with something that felt almost like redemption. She had stopped casting reflections in mirrors. She could touch sunlight through the stained glass of the manor windows and feel only the gentlest warmth, no burning. Her teeth never fully retracted anymore, just filed themselves sharper while she slept. And the hunger. God, the hunger was becoming a constant companion, a second heartbeat driving every thought toward only one goal: more blood, more closeness, more of him. The worst part was that she didn't entirely mind. The transformation was changing not just her body, but her consciousness. The blood memory that had started as flashes of her ancestor's life was now constant, a kind of dual awareness where Evangeline existed simultaneously as herself and as every woman who had borne her name across 4 centuries. She knew things she had no reason to know. The Spanish Armada's approach through her great-great-great-grandmother's fear, the taste of Victorian laudanum through her mother's despair, the particular loneliness of existing neither alive nor dead, of being a thing that shouldn't exist according to every natural law, and through it all, like a constant star guiding her through darkness, was Lysander. He was careful with her, treating her emerging predatory nature with the gentleness of someone teaching a child to walk. He showed her how to control the hunger, how to feed without killing, how to sense the pulse of life in mortal flesh without succumbing to the need to drain it completely. He demonstrated the peculiar dignity of vampiric existence, how to move through the night like it was your natural element, how to find beauty in the darkness that had always been your cage. But on the 8th night, that careful control shattered. It happened as they were walking the grounds of Raven's Hollow. The autumn moon was full and brilliant, casting everything in silver-white light. Evangeline wore a new dress, black velvet that Lysander had produced from somewhere in the manor's depths. It fit her like a second skin, like it had been tailored centuries ago with her precise measurements. They reached the old graveyard where they had buried the manor's dead for 200 years. Evangeline recognized several of the names from the blood memory, distant relatives, keeper-servants of the covenant who knew its existence and kept silence. That's when she smelled it. Blood. Fresh blood. Coming from beyond the graveyard fence, from the mortal village that existed on the margin of Raven's Hollow's estate, The smell triggered something primal in her new nature, something that had nothing to do with Evangeline's consciousness, and everything to do with the predator she was becoming. She moved toward the fence with no conscious decision, drawn like a compass needle toward true north. Lysander's hand caught her arm, gentle but immovable. "No," he said quietly. She signed, her movements sharp with hunger. "Why? What is the point of being this if we cannot hunt?" His expression was infinitely sad. "Is that what you think this is becoming? Simple predation?" He turned her to face him fully, and in the moonlight she saw his own transformation, not of body, but of soul. The weight of 4 centuries sat on his shoulders like a physical thing. "I have spent 400 years trying to be more than appetite, Evangeline, trying to prove that what we are, can be something other than monsters consuming the innocent." He gestured back toward the manor. "Your ancestors' family knew the Covenant existed. They helped us hide. They understood that what we were could be managed, controlled, directed towards something approaching nobility. We fed from volunteers, willing feeders, people who understood what we were and offered themselves in exchange for protection or coin, or simply for the ecstasy of being fed upon by something eternal." Evangeline felt the hunger recede slightly as understanding crystallized. The curse doesn't make you a killer. It makes you a choice, moment after moment, deciding what kind of creature you will be. She looked at her own hands and saw them trembling. The predatory hunger was still there, but now it was contextual. Hunger managed by consent, by conscience, by the strange moral weight of immortality. She could feed. The village beyond the fence held dozens of possible prey, but she would choose not to, because Lysander had chosen not to. 400 years of nights choosing restraint over appetite. And "Come," he said gently, releasing her arm. "There is someone I want you to meet, someone who can help you understand what you are becoming beyond just hunger and blood." He led her deeper into the grounds, away from the graveyard, and toward a cottage Evangeline hadn't noticed before. Small, thatched, with light glowing in its windows, despite the hour. As they approached, the door opened. A woman emerged, middle-aged, scarred, wearing the practical dress of a servant, but carrying herself with the dignity of nobility. Her neck bore marks, deep fang marks, scarred but visible, the sign of long-term feeding. "Master Lysander," she said, and her voice was warm with familiarity. "And this is the new Evangeline, then? She has your eyes. The last one did, too." Lysander's arm came around Evangeline's waist. "Evangeline, this is Margaret. She has been the keeper of Raven's Hollow for 60 years since your mother's time. She knows the Covenant. She has volunteered to be your teacher in what you must become." Margaret smiled, and Evangeline saw no fear in the scarred woman's face, only compassion and something that might have been envy. "Not just teacher, child. I fed the last Evangeline 3 times a week for the 8 years I knew her. I'll feed you if you consent, with full knowledge of what it means, what it costs, and what you'll become through it." Evangeline felt tears, blood tears, slide down her cheeks. For the first time since the transformation began, she realized that the Covenant didn't have to be a curse in the way she'd feared. It could be something else, a covenant of genuine consent, of willing sacrifice, of people choosing to bind themselves to darkness not through deception, but through knowledge and love. She signed to Margaret. "Why would you do this?" The old woman's eyes crinkled with what might have been memory. "Because your mother saved my life when the hunters came. She took a bullet meant for me, stayed vampire long enough to ensure I escaped, then let herself be staked so I could live to old age. That's the kind of creature the Covenant makes you, child, the kind that loves even unto death." Lysander's arm tightened around her, and when Evangeline turned to look at him, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not just longing, but hope. Real hope. The first genuine belief that this cycle might finally be different, that this Evangeline might actually live. "Feed from her," he whispered. "Not because you're hungry, but because she's offering consent, because her blood is given freely, as a gift. That's what separates us from monsters, Evangeline. That's what makes the Covenant something sacred instead of something damned." Evangeline took Margaret's offered arm, felt the old woman relax in her grip, and tasted blood that had nothing to do with predatory hunger and everything to do with understanding, with connection, with the profound gift of being accepted as what she truly was. And in the darkness of Ravenshollow's grounds, under a moon that had watched 4 centuries of Evangelines come and go, she began to understand that the monster the blood had made her might, after all, be capable of grace. Chapter 7. The Gothic Trial. The hunters came on the 14th night of her transformation. They came with fire and holy water, with crosses blessed in Rome and thorns soaked in the blood of saints. They came in a convoy of 3 wagons, led by a man whose scarred face bore the marks of previous encounters with the undead, a man whose name, Evangeline would learn, was Inquisitor Thorn, and who had been hunting Lysander Ashworth for 40 years. The attack came without warning. One moment, Evangeline was in the library with Margaret, learning the names and histories of the voluntary feeders who had sustained the covenant across centuries. The next, the manor windows exploded inward, and the air filled with the acrid stench of blessed flame. "The cellar," Margaret gasped, pushing her toward the hidden door. "Go to the catacombs. Lysander will have prepared an exit route. You must not let them take you." Evangeline's fangs extended fully, instinct overriding training. She wanted to fight, wanted to feel the blood of these intruders spill across her new teeth. The predator in her, barely suppressed since Margaret's teachings had begun, screamed for violence. But Margaret's scarred hands gripped her shoulders. "Listen to me, child. These hunters, they're immune to vampire compulsion. They're trained, blessed, ready for you. Your only advantage is that they don't know you exist. To them, there is only Lysander. Use that. Run." The sounds of combat erupted through the manor, furniture toppling, walls cracking under impact. Lysander's roar split the night, a sound of fury and anguish that made something in Evangeline's chest fracture. She ran. The catacombs beneath Ravenshollow were vast and ancient, predating the manor itself. They must have been the reason the Covenant had chosen this location centuries ago. Underground passages that stretched for miles, connecting to the old limestone caves that riddled this part of England. Lysander's voice echoed behind her as she fled, not calling for help, but driving the hunters away from her path, creating a distraction with his own body. Selfless as always, the blood memory whispered through her consciousness, just as the first Evangeline chose him, just as every incarnation has chosen. She burst through a doorway into a vast underground chamber, lit by nothing but the faint bioluminescence of some ancient fungal growth. The far wall showed a river, underground, black, running swift with the meltwater of deeps. Earth. Behind her, firelight bloomed. Evangeline spun to find Inquisitor Thorn advancing, his silver sword burning with holy magic, his eyes filled with the zealous certainty of someone who believed himself God's instrument. Behind him came 3 others, priests in dark vestments, chanting prayers that made her skin blister. "Spawn of darkness," Thorn's voice was gravel and venom. "I have hunted the Ancient One for 4 decades. Now I shall have the satisfaction of destroying his corruption entire." He raised the sword, and Evangeline felt the hunger scream through her. Not for blood now, but for violence, for defense, for the right to survive. "Not like this," Lysander's voice came to her through the blood bond. It was agony to hear. He was wounded, being held down, forced to remain still by chains of blessed silver that burned through even his immortal flesh. "Run, Evangeline. Live. Let me buy you time." She ran. The river carried her deep into the earth, through passages that twisted and turned until the sounds of combat faded to echoes, then to nothing. She swam in water cold enough to freeze mortal blood, but her new nature felt it as a cleansing, a washing away of the gentle life she had been living in the manor. By the time she emerged, hours later, dawn was approaching. The sky to the east blushed with the first colors of sunrise. Evangeline found herself on the banks of a river in what she recognized as the outer wilderness, 10 miles from Ravenshollow, perhaps more. She stood naked and shaking, her dress torn away by the river passage, and watched the sun rise over the world she had thought herself bound to forever. And nothing happened. The sunlight touched her skin, and though it burned slightly more than candlelight, it did not consume her. She could walk in daylight. The realization hit her like a revelation. She was not truly a creature of darkness. She was the bridge, as Lysander had said. She could exist in the mortal world, but he cannot. The thought nearly broke her. Lysander was bound to darkness, truly and completely. He could not follow her into the sunlight. Even now, as the hunters pressed him, he could not escape into the day because his nature would not permit it. Evangeline turned back toward Ravenshollow. She moved as fast as her new nature allowed, running that was barely running, more like flowing across the landscape. By the time she reached the manor boundaries, the sun was 3/4 risen, and she could feel its weight on her skin like a shield, like armor against whatever remained. The manor was burning. Flames consumed the east wing entirely, the place where the Covenant chamber lay. The main structure was scarred but standing, though she could see Inquisitor Thorn and his people moving through it, destroying, purifying, erasing every trace of the darkness that had lived here. They were no longer hunting. They were celebrating. Evangeline found the cellar entrance through a path the blood memory had preserved in her consciousness, not learned knowledge, but inherited wisdom from her ancestors' 400 years of hiding. She descended into darkness and moved deeper, into the catacombs, following the path she had fled down hours before. She found them in the underground chamber. Lysander was chained, his skin burned where the blessed silver had touched him, his hair burned away from holy fire. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was waiting, his eyes tracking toward her, the moment she emerged from the darkness, as if some part of him had known she would return. "You ran," he said, and there was no recrimination in his voice, only something broken and infinitely sad. "You made the choice I always wanted you to make. You survived." Evangeline fell to her knees before him, her hands reaching for his, as if touch could mend the wounds that would soon kill even an immortal creature if the blessed chains remained. "How do I break the chains?" she signed, her movements frantic. Lysander smiled, that sad, tragic smile she was learning to read the way she read her own heartbeat. "You can't, beloved. The blessed silver burns anything with vampiric taint. You are partly mortal, so you might touch them briefly, but the moment you try to sever them, the magic will corrupt you as well." She felt tears of blood spill down her face. "This is the trial the Covenant always promised," Lysander whispered. "The moment where you must choose what you are willing to lose to save him. Your ancestor faced it when the hunters came for the first transformation. She chose to let herself be damned eternally rather than let me face damnation alone." His eyes held hers. "What will you choose, Evangeline? Will you save yourself and let me die? Or will you take the final step and accept true vampirehood so that you might have the strength to free me?" Outside, Inquisitor Thorn's voice echoed through the manor. "We burn the east wing entirely. Leave no stone unturned. Let nothing remain of the corruption." The ancient wood of the manor, the wood that had housed the Covenant for 400 years, was already beginning to smoke, to collapse. Ash would soon fill even these deep catacombs. There was perhaps an hour before the fire found them, and Evangeline faced at last the true nature of what binding herself to a vampire meant. Not romance or eternal life or transcendent connection, but this, a series of impossible choices where every option cost something precious, and the only way forward was to accept the cost fully, knowingly, without reservation. She signed, "Tell me how. Tell me how to become what you are." Lysander's chains rattled as he tried to move closer. "Evangeline, no!" But she was already pressing her wrist to her own fangs, drawing blood, and pressing that bleeding wrist to his mouth. "Drink," she whispered aloud, knowing that by now, her voice, when she chose to use it, carried weight. "Bind me completely. Make me what you are. I'm choosing this, fully, consciously. Let me choose it." He drank. and as his blood mingled with hers in the darkness of the catacombs, as the covenant magic burned through her veins with transformative fury, Evangeline felt the last of her mortality burn away. She felt her heart slow and finally stop its beating entirely. She felt the hunger that had been a constant companion transform into something she could finally master, finally direct. She became what her ancestor had been, fully, truly, completely his. And then, with her new strength, she tore the blessed chains apart. Chapter 8. Blood and desire converge. They did not leave Raven's Hollow. Instead, they descended deeper. The catacombs beneath the manor extended far beyond what Evangeline had imagined during her frantic flight. They were not simple passageways, but an entire civilization, a network of chambers carved from living stone centuries ago, perhaps by the very hands that had originally crafted the covenant itself. Lysander guided her through passages lit by his intimate knowledge, and she realized that these chambers had been his sanctuary long before her grandmother's time. They were the real Raven's Hollow, the true estate beneath the surface manor, where the covenant had taken root in darkness and stone. As they descended, she felt the transformation complete itself inside her. Her body, no longer half-mortal, had become perfectly adapted to the dark. She could see in absolute blackness as clearly as others saw in noon sunlight. She could hear the whisper of air moving through passages a quarter-mile distant. And the hunger, God, the hunger that had been manageable with feeding from Margaret, was now a roaring beast inside her, demanding, insistent, ravenous. "It will pass," Lysander said, his hand warm against the small of her back as they walked. "The first days of true vampirehood are always the hardest. The hunger is all-consuming, but you will learn to master it, as I did. You will learn that the hunt is not about needless killing, but about the dance between predator and prey, the strange beauty of feeding when it is offered in consent and understanding." They reached a vast chamber that took her breath away, or would have if she still needed breath. It was a library, but not like any library she had ever seen. The walls were carved from living rock, and shelves had been grown rather than built. Organic curves that held thousands of volumes bound in leather, parchment, vellum. And at the center of the chamber sat a great stone altar, carved with symbols that matched those in the covenant chamber above. "This is where it began," Lysander whispered. "This is where your ancestor and I made the choice that bound us forever." He led her to the altar, and there, preserved under glass, lay the original covenant document, written in handwriting Evangeline recognized from her blood memory as her ancestors' own exquisite script. But what caught her attention was not the words, but the signatures at the bottom. Evangeline Ashworth and Lysander Ashworth, both written in trembling, passionate script, followed by a handprint in what could only be blood. "She wanted the world to know she chose this," Lysander explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Wanted her name bound to mine, publicly, eternally, so that no one could ever claim she was victim or possession. She was as much master of this covenant as I was." Evangeline's own hand moved before conscious thought could stop it. She drew the blade that hung at Lysander's hip and made a cut across her palm, letting blood flow. She pressed her hand against the glass, and where her blood touched, symbols began to glow, ancient runes activating, resonating with her newly transformed nature. The glass dissolved. She could touch the document now, and when she did, the blood memory flooded through her with such force that she nearly wept. She experienced the original covenant ceremony fully, not as fragmented visions, but as complete three-dimensional memory. She felt her ancestors' terror and determination in equal measure. She felt the moment when Lysander's transformation magic had burned through her body, remaking her into something new. And she felt, most crucially, the moment when she understood what she had become, not a victim of the covenant, but an architect of it, equal partner in magic older than nations. Lysander's arms came around her from behind, pulling her close. "I was always terrified," he whispered into her hair. "Terrified that I was predator to your prey. Terrified that the covenant was simply another form of damnation I was inflicting on innocent women. But she, the first Evangeline, she showed me that power could be shared, That darkness didn't have to be solitary. That even the damned could find love that was reciprocal, not parasitic. Evangeline turned in his arms, and for the first time since her transformation, she saw him not as the tragic figure she had drawn 100 times, but as he truly was. A man who had carried grief for 400 years and somehow remained capable of gentleness. A man who had been given immortality and chosen conscience instead of cruelty. A man who had waited through 7 incarnations of the woman he loved, knowing that each one would eventually be lost to him again. She signed, "You don't have to lose me, not this time." "I will always lose you," he said, and the words were not cruel but honest. The covenant does not offer forever, Evangeline. It offers perhaps a century, perhaps 2 if the magic holds. And then I'll come back, she interrupted, speaking aloud for the first time with her true voice. It was different now. Velvet and midnight. The voice of something that existed between worlds. The blood memory shows me the truth. I keep coming back because some part of me, through every incarnation, chooses you. The covenant doesn't trap us. It gives us the chance to keep choosing each other. She pulled him down into a kiss. The hunger inside her roared in triumph, but it was hunger transmuted by understanding, by consent, by the profound knowledge that here was a man who could satisfy not just her appetite, but her soul. She tasted blood in his mouth, her own blood, mingled with his, and understood that this was what the covenant had always been reaching toward. True fusion, true oneness, the dissolution of boundaries between self and other. They made love in the chamber of the original covenant, surrounded by 400 years of accumulated history and magic. Their bodies moved with the perfect synchronization of 2 creatures, whose blood was now intermingled, whose consciousness was bound at the deepest level. And as Lysander entered her, as she arched beneath him in the darkness, Evangeline felt the covenant magic respond, singing through her veins like a symphony. For the first time in 400 years, the magic was no longer simply sustaining them, it was celebrating. When they finally lay still, wrapped in each other in the dust of ancient stone, Evangeline felt Lysander tremble. When she pulled back far enough to see his face, she found him weeping. Blood tears, like her own. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "I don't deserve you, not again, not after everything." She silenced him with another kiss, and then she took his face between her hands and made him meet her eyes. She signed slowly, deliberately, "You deserve this. I choose this. I choose you." Not because the covenant demands it, not because of blood magic or prophecy, but because in 400 years of searching, I have found the one thing that makes immortality worth living. You. Outside, above the catacombs, Raven's Hollow burned, but down in the darkness, in the chambers that had sheltered the covenant since its beginning, Evangeline and Lysander held each other and felt, for the first time in centuries, something like peace. Chapter 9. Covenant acknowledged, they emerged from the catacombs 3 nights later. Raven's Hollow Manor was a smoldering ruin, its blackened stones still steaming in the cold autumn air. But the fire had not been able to reach the depths beneath the earth. Those ancient chambers remained intact, preserved, waiting. And more importantly, the destruction of the manor above had killed Inquisitor Thorne's certainty that he had succeeded. His people had left, satisfied that they had destroyed the vampire's lair. They did not know that the true covenant had never been housed in the fragile wood and stone above ground. Lysander and Evangeline stood among the ruins as dawn approached, watching the first light creep across the landscape. Evangeline could feel the weight of the coming sun, like a familiar companion now. Where once it had felt like restraint, it now felt like choice. She could face the day, but the night was where her true power lay. "What do we do now?" she asked aloud, still marveling at the strangeness of her own voice, velvet and resonant, carrying harmonics no mortal throat could produce. Lysander's arm came around her waist. "We live," he said simply. "We move on from Raven's Hollow. Travel as your ancestors did. We find places where we can exist without constant hunting. There are others like us, you know. Old things that have learned to coexist with the mortal world. Covens in major cities, creatures of the night who have decided that hunting humans is inefficient and morally bankrupt. He turned her to face him fully. Your mother believed that the future belonged to vampires who could integrate, who could find volunteers willing to feed them, who could exist as something other than monsters in the shadows. She was building something when the hunters found her. I want to finish what she started. Evangeline felt the blood memory stir with recognition. Yes, her mother had spoken of this through the inherited consciousness. There were networks, places of sanctuary, communities of the willing feeders who understood what they were choosing. But first, Lysander continued, there is something I need to give you, something that should have been given to the first Evangeline, but was lost in the chaos of our escape. He reached inside his coat and withdrew a ring, not delicate or feminine, but substantial, wrought from silver and iron worked together in a way that should not have been possible. The metal seemed to shift between states, sometimes silver, sometimes dark iron, sometimes something in between. And set into the band was a stone that was not quite ruby, not quite diamond, something that held captured starlight within it. This is the covenant ring, Lysander said, his voice dropping to something sacred. It is older than the ceremony itself. It belonged to the woman whose bloodline magic created the covenant in the first place, a sorceress in the 12th century who fell in love with a vampire and cursed them both to seek each other across eternity. Every Evangeline has worn this ring. Everyone understood what it meant, that the covenant was not punishment, but choice. He held it toward her. I am asking you to wear this, fully and consciously, as acknowledgement of the bond between us, as declaration that you know exactly what you are choosing, and you choose it anyway. This is not a glamour or a compulsion. You can refuse, and I will honor that refusal, but if you accept, then the magic itself will recognize you as equal partner in the covenant, not subject, but sovereign. Evangeline looked at the ring, and through the blood memory she could see every Evangeline who had worn it, a procession of women across 400 years, each one beautiful, each one fierce, each one fully aware that they were binding themselves to eternal darkness, and each one, in the moment of choice, had smiled. She took the ring and slipped it onto her finger. The moment it touched her skin, the covenant magic in the ruins around them erupted into sudden, brilliant visibility. The blackened stones of Raven's Hollow began to glow with silver runes. The earth beneath their feet pulsed with ancient power, and the night sky, directly above them, seemed to split, revealing something like a connection between their world and a realm beyond, a place that existed in shadow and starlight, where the oldest magic still held sway. Evangeline felt her consciousness expand, where before she had been aware only of herself and her connection to Lysander through blood. Now she felt the entire structure of the covenant laid bare before her. She understood, with absolute clarity, that she was woven into the very fabric of the magic itself, that her will and the covenant's will were no longer separate, that every choice she made from this moment forward would carry the weight of 400 years of accumulated destiny. But she also felt something else, freedom, true freedom, because now that she was recognized as equal partner by the magic itself, she could shape it as much as it shaped her. She could transform the covenant from a curse into something else entirely. I can see it, she whispered, her eyes on the rifting sky. I can see what my mother wanted to build, a world where vampires and mortals exist in covenant with each other, where feeding is ritualized, consensual, sacred, where the darkness doesn't have to be solitary or brutal. She turned to Lysander, and her expression held something like revelation. We don't have to run anymore. We can build this, not here. Inquisitor Thorn will eventually realize the manor still stands, in some form, but elsewhere. Somewhere we can establish sanctuary, somewhere the covenant can truly flourish. Lysander looked at her with an expression so full of hope and wonder that it seemed to remake his face entirely. 400 years, he whispered. 400 years. I waited for an Evangeline who would see the covenant not as curse, but as foundation for something greater. I was beginning to think it would never happen. She took his face between her hands and kissed him as the midnight bells tolled from the distant village church, as the covenant magic burned like silver fire around them, as every stone of Raven's Hollow answered with its own illumination. "It happened," she said against his mouth. "I'm here. I'm choosing this. And I'm choosing to make it into everything my mother believed it could be." The sky above them cleared, the rift ceiling, but the glow in the ruins remained. A benediction from the covenant magic itself, approval from forces ancient and inexorable. Evangeline and Lysander stood in that light, two creatures born of darkness and starlight, and for the first time in 400 years, the covenant's magic sang, not in sorrow, but in triumph. The hunt had ended. The true covenant was just beginning. Chapter 10. Final darkness. The sanctuary they built took shape over months in the ruins of Raven's Hollow. They did not restore the manor itself, but transformed the catacombs into something new, not a hidden refuge, but a fortress of their own creation. Evangeline used her blood gift with Lysander's centuries of knowledge, and together they wove the covenant magic into the very stone, creating passages that could not be found unless they permitted it, chambers that existed partially in Shadow Realm, sanctuaries where both vampire and willing mortal could coexist in safety. Margaret and the other longtime feeders came willingly, bringing with them knowledge of networks that spanned continents. There were vampire covens in Vienna and Prague, in Moscow and Istanbul. There were communities of humans who had learned, across generations, that feeding the undead was not curse, but choice, a way to bond with something eternal, to taste immortality through the exchange of blood. Evangeline discovered in herself an aptitude for building these networks, for understanding both the psychology of fear that made humans recoil from the undead and the psychology of longing that made them embrace connection with darkness. She was the bridge, as Lysander had always said. She existed in both worlds, could speak both languages, could teach each side to see the other's humanity. But on the night that should have been their greatest triumph, everything shattered. The envoy came as dusk fell, not alone, but accompanied by guards bearing the sigil of the Vampire Council of Europe, the ancient governing body that had existed in secret for millennia. And at their head came something that made even Lysander step back in recognition and fear. Aramis Blackwood. Lysander's voice dropped to barely a whisper. The progenitor, the first vampire. The creature that walked into their sanctuary was impossible. It was male and female, young and ancient, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. It wore the appearance of a man in his prime, dark-skinned, regal, with eyes that held no white or pupil, only infinite darkness. The air around him seemed to ripple with power, as if reality itself was uncertain of his presence. Lysander Ashworth. The progenitor's voice was wind through tombs, was the whisper of ancient darkness given language. I have been aware of your covenant for 400 years. I allowed it to persist because I was entertained by the novelty of a vampire who chose conscience over instinct. His gaze turned to Evangeline, and she felt the weight of his regard like a physical force, like standing before an open furnace and feeling its heat burn through all the pretense of mortal flesh. But this, Aramis continued, gesturing to their sanctuary, this is problematic. You are creating the seeds of revolution. You are teaching vampires that they can be something other than what they are made to be. You are suggesting that consent and covenant can replace domination and hunger. And worst of all, you are involving the covenant magic itself in your heresy. Lysander stepped forward, positioning himself between Evangeline and the progenitor. The covenant has existed for 400 years without your interference. The magic that binds us is older than your authority, Aramis. It does not answer to the Council of Europe. No, Aramis agreed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But it answers to me. I am the source of all vampiric magic, Lysander. Every vampire that exists is my spawn, or spawn of my spawn, carrying my blood through lineage and infection. And the covenant magic, his smile widened. That originated from a mortal bloodline, a sorcerer's curse, but it has become entwined with vampiric essence. It is now, in part, mine." He raised one hand, and Evangeline felt something terrible happening, a pressure in her chest, as if the covenant magic itself was being pulled away from her, reclaimed. The ring on her finger burned with cold that was somehow more agonizing than any heat. "I am going to offer you a choice, Evangeline Ashworth," Aramis said, and his voice was reasonable, almost gentle. "Abandon this fool's project. Renounce the covenant magic. Come to the council and serve as an advisor on human psychology. You would be valuable in that capacity. Or I will break the covenant entirely. I will shatter the magic that binds you to Lysander, and I will begin the process of hunting down and executing every single volunteer feeder you have built into this network." Evangeline felt Lysander's hand find hers, felt the warm solidity of him anchoring her against the progenitor's crushing presence. She looked at his face, marked by 400 years of waiting, scarred by loss, but radiating something immovable. Love and absolute certainty in what they had built. "What do you want to do?" She signed to him, knowing that despite the hopelessness of the moment, the choice had to be his. She was bound to him, but that binding worked both ways, and Lysander smiled. "I choose you," he said simply. "Every version of you, every incarnation, every moment across 4 centuries. I choose you over the council, over the progenitor, over eternal life itself." He turned to face Aramis fully. "You said the covenant magic is in part yours, but you're wrong. The covenant magic is in part hers, the original Evangeline's bloodline. It's rooted in human sorcery, mortal magic, something you can influence but never fully control. And now it's rooted in Evangeline herself, who carries both the mortal and vampire essences in perfect balance." Lysander's expression was radiant, almost beatific. "You can break my binding to the covenant, but you cannot break hers. And if you do, if you try to sever the magic, you'll only accelerate the process that's already happening. You'll only make the covenant harder to control." Aramis's smile faded. "You would sacrifice yourself." "I would have done it 400 years ago," Lysander replied. "Every day since then, I would have done it. There is nothing the progenitor of all vampires could offer that would match the value of one more day with her." The progenitor was silent for a long moment. The air in the sanctuary seemed to still, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Then Aramis laughed, a sound like continental drift, like mountains grinding into dust. "You are every kind of fool," he said, and there was something almost like admiration in his tone. "You understand, don't you, that by refusing me, by choosing her, you have sealed your own fate? The council will hunt you. The Inquisition will hunt you. I myself may eventually decide your experiment is more trouble than it's worth." "I know," Lysander said peacefully, "and you choose this anyway." "I choose her," Lysander repeated, as if it were the simplest answer in the world. "I would choose her over paradise, Aramis. I would choose her over eternal life. I would choose her over everything the universe could offer. That is what 400 years of loving one woman teaches you. There is nothing that compares." Aramis regarded them both for a long moment, and something shifted in his infinite dark eyes. Not kindness, for the progenitor seemed incapable of such human emotion, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding of a choice so complete, so total, that it transcended his vampiric nature entirely and spoke to something deeper, the fundamental human capacity to love beyond reason, beyond survival, beyond rational calculation. "The council will still hunt you," he said finally, "but not by my hand. Let this experiment of yours continue. Let your covenant spread, if it can. I am curious to see what will come of a world where vampires and mortals learn to love each other. Whether it will be transcendence or damnation." He turned to leave, then paused. "If you survive the next century, Lysander Ashworth, come find me. We will talk, and perhaps I will finally understand what it is about this mortal-born magic that calls to you so strongly." Then he was gone, dissolving into shadow and starlight, leaving behind only the faintest scent of ancient dust and the feeling of having stood in the presence of something that predated human civilization itself. Evangeline and Lysander collapsed into each other's arms, trembling not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of having stared into absolute darkness and refused to blink. "Did that just—" Evangeline whispered. "Yes," Lysander said, wonder in his voice. "I think we just convinced the progenitor to let us live." Chapter 11. Eternal Resolution. 50 years later, Evangeline sat in the library beneath Raven's Hollow and sketched. She was no longer the silent girl with charcoal and paper, though she retained the ability to speak without sound when she chose. Now she was the keeper of the covenant, the woman whose face appeared in stories whispered across continents by those who had tasted immortal love. She had grown into her power in ways she could never have imagined during those first frantic nights of transformation. The network they had built spanned Europe now. In major cities there existed sanctuaries, places where vampires and their willing feeders could gather in safety. The covenant had evolved, crystallized into something that was no longer just personal magic, but institutional truth. Young vampires came to learn from her how to resist the killing hunger, how to understand feeding as sacred ritual rather than predatory act. Young mortals came to voluntarily offer themselves, understanding fully what they would receive, ecstasy and danger in equal measure, the gift of touching the eternal. Not all vampire covens accepted the covenant's philosophy. The old predators still existed, still hunted, still took what they wanted without consent. But there were enough who believed now, enough who had found their way to Lysander and Evangeline's vision, that the vampire world had shifted perceptibly. The age of solitary darkness was ending. The age of community and covenant was beginning. The sketches she was making now were not visions, but memories. After 50 years, the blood memory had become so integrated with her own consciousness that she no longer distinguished between what she had experienced directly and what she had inherited from her ancestors. She sketched Evangeline 1643 on her wedding night, understanding both the terror and the transcendent joy of that first transformation. She sketched her mother, beautiful and fierce, raising her daughter while hiding from hunters. She sketched herself as she had been at 23, mute and terrified, and unable to imagine that her inherited gift would transform her entire world. "You're remembering again." Lysander's voice came from the doorway, still velvet and midnight, still holding centuries of accumulated sorrow, but now balanced by something lighter. He had spent the last 50 years learning what Evangeline had learned, that happiness was possible for the damned, that love could be sustainable across decades rather than just moments, that immortality was livable if one had the right companion. She set down her charcoal and turned to him. He looked exactly as he had when she first saw him in the portrait. Not aged, but somehow more at peace. The centuries no longer weighed on him the way they once had. "I was remembering the first Evangeline," she told him, thinking about the moment she chose the covenant, wondering if she ever regretted it. Lysander sat beside her, pulling her close. "You could ask her directly if you wanted. The blood memory is clear enough now that you could probably conduct something like a conversation with your ancestor." Evangeline had tried this before, reaching into the depths of the blood memory, attempting to communicate with the consciousness of her ancestor that existed within her own mind. It had mostly resulted in sensations and visions, rather than words, but Lysander was right that the boundary was becoming thinner. She closed her eyes and descended into the depths of blood memory, past the layers of inherited experience, until she reached something like the core of the first Evangeline's consciousness, a presence that was separate from herself but intimately connected, like a thought that existed just beyond direct access. "Did you regret it?" she asked, and the answer came not in words but in sensation, the taste of Lysander's mouth on that first night, the ecstasy of transformation, the terror of understanding that she had chosen something that could never be undone. The decades of perfect happiness, brief as they were in the context of centuries, the anguish of watching Lysander age while she remained frozen, the final relief when the curse transformed her completely, ending the slow degradation. But underneath all of that, One overwhelming truth: no, never. I would choose him again, in every lifetime, in every incarnation. I would choose him knowing exactly what comes next. The only regret is that I could not stay longer. Evangeline opened her eyes to find tears streaming down her face. Lysander's expression was tender, understanding that she had just conversed with the deepest parts of herself and heard her own answer echoed across 400 years. "She's here," Evangeline whispered. "Not as a separate voice, but as part of me. She's always been part of me. And she's telling me that what we built is right, that the covenant is right, that—" Lysander silenced her with a kiss, and Evangeline felt the familiar rush of certainty that came from their connection. In 50 years, she had never grown tired of his touch, never tired of the way his mouth tasted of darkness and devotion, never tired of the profound knowledge that she was loved by someone who understood the weight of forever. "I want to make something official," Lysander said when they parted, "a declaration witnessed by the council and the progenitor himself. I want to formally name you not just as my Evangeline, but as keeper of the covenant, as the woman who shaped it, who built it, who transformed curse into blessing." Evangeline felt the weight of what he was offering. To be named keeper would be to take on a responsibility that extended beyond their small sanctuary. It would mean shaping policy for vampire covens across continents. It would mean meeting with the council, negotiating with the progenitor, wrestling with the ancient structures of vampire power itself. She thought of her mother, who had died before the covenant could truly flourish. She thought of her ancestor, who had loved so completely that she'd been willing to risk eternal damnation. She thought of the 7 Evangelines who had come before her, all of them fragments of her, all of them leading to this moment where the covenant magic had finally crystallized into something permanent and real. "Yes," she said aloud, for the first time speaking her agreement not through sign language or blood memory, but through her own voice, clear and certain. "I will be keeper. I will carry forward what the First Evangeline began. Lysander's smile was incandescent. He drew the covenant ring from his pocket, a different ring than the one she had worn, more ornate, marked with symbols that had been added over the last 50 years by every feeding that had occurred in their sanctuary. It was a map of relationships, she realized, a physical record of every connection between vampire and mortal that had been conducted with full consent and mutual love. He slipped it onto her other hand, and as he did, the covenant magic throughout the entire sanctuary bloomed into visibility, a web of silver thread connecting every chamber, every resident, every voluntary feeder. It was a network of love and light hidden beneath the surface of the world, a secret revolution being conducted through blood and covenant rather than violence and force. "The first Evangeline would be proud," Lysander whispered. Evangeline looked at her hands, bearing now 2 rings, 2 marks of covenant, 2 declarations of binding that spanned centuries. She understood then what immortality truly meant. It was not endless years stretching into meaninglessness. It was the chance to watch your choices ripple forward through generations, to see your sacrifice become someone else's hope, to love so completely that your love transcended your individual lifetime and became part of the fabric of the world itself. Outside the sanctuary, dawn was approaching. Lysander would need to retreat into shadow soon, to sleep beneath the earth where the old vampire magic ran deepest. But before he did, he held Evangeline in the last moments before sunrise, and she held him back, and they remained suspended in that perfect moment where darkness was ending and light was beginning. Neither one nor the other, but existing in the liminal space between, just as their covenant had always done. "I love you," she whispered in the voice that had taken 50 years to fully claim. "I love you," Lysander replied, "in this incarnation and in every incarnation to come, for as long as the covenant endures, and beyond." The midnight bells tolled in the distance, though it was nearly dawn, an anomaly, perhaps, of the magic-soaked sanctuary, or perhaps a blessing from the covenant itself, from the forces that had guided every Evangeline toward this man, this darkness, this choice made freely and repeatedly across 400 years. Evangeline rested her head against Lysander's chest and felt the eternal silence of his stopped heart. She knew that someday, decades from now, centuries perhaps, the covenant would transform again. The magic would evolve, the circumstances would change, the world would demand new iterations of sacrifice and love. But for now, in this moment, she was content. She had chosen darkness and found light. She had embraced the curse and discovered it was a gift. She had loved a monster and learned that he was human in all the ways that truly mattered. And tomorrow, when the sun set again, she would rise and continue the work of building a world where such love was possible, not just for the doomed and the damned, but for anyone brave enough to accept the binding that came with true, eternal devotion. The mute girl had drawn a picture of a man no one else could see. And he, the vampire bound to her bloodline, the creature cursed with 400 years of immortal love, had been waiting all along for her to finally understand that the picture she'd been drawing all her life was not a fantasy or vision, but a portrait of her own eternal future. She had found her way home, and home, at last, was where she wanted to stay. Epilogue. The Shadows Echo. 5 years later, Evangeline Ashworth received a visitor to the sanctuary who changed everything. The woman was young, no more than 20, with dark hair and pale skin that spoke of recent transformation. She moved with the careful precision of someone newly cursed, still learning how to navigate a body that was no longer entirely her own. "My name is Evangeline Mercer," the woman said, and her voice carried the peculiar harmonics of newborn vampirehood, the conflict between human speech patterns and something other, something predatory. "I was born Evangeline, and I was transformed 6 months ago by a vampire I loved. I've come because I heard that there was a woman here, also named Evangeline, who understood what it meant to be bound to someone for eternity." Evangeline felt something shift in her blood. She gestured for the younger woman to sit, and as she did, something flared in her awareness. The blood memory stirred, but not with visions of the past. It stirred with recognition of something that hadn't happened yet. "Tell me your story," Evangeline said gently, and as young Evangeline Mercer began to describe her vampire lover, his sadness, his centuries of waiting, his insistence that she understand exactly what she was choosing, Evangeline found herself looking at the covenant ring on her own hand. The ring began to glow, not with the light of the past, but with light extending into the future. New symbols appeared on its surface, adding themselves to the map of relationships that had been carved into it over centuries. The symbols formed the outline of a new sanctuary, a new city, a new network of love and covenant. Evangeline understood then what the progenitor had meant when he said he was curious what would come of this experiment. The covenant wasn't static. It didn't end. It propagated itself through every woman brave enough to love a vampire, through every vampire noble enough to refuse simple predation. The covenant was becoming a religion of its own. "I need to ask you something," Evangeline said to the younger woman, "and I need you to answer with absolute truth. Did you come here because you regretted your choice? Because you want to be freed from the binding?" Young Evangeline Mercer's eyes, ringed with silver like all vampires but still holding human warmth, filled with tears of blood. "No," she whispered, "I came because he's suffering. He thinks he's destroyed me, that I hate him for what I've become. I came to find proof that immortality with the one you love isn't damnation, that it can be beautiful." Evangeline reached across the table and took the younger woman's hands. She felt the covenant magic respond, recognized in this stranger a version of herself, a reflection of her own journey across the decades. "It can be beautiful," she said softly. "The immortality isn't the blessing. The blessing is the immortal. The rest, the hunger, the darkness, the loss, it's all bearable if you have someone who loves you enough to suffer through it with you." She paused, then added, "Go back to him. Tell him that what you are together is sacred, that the covenant will protect you both. And if he ever doubts again, tell him to send word to Raven's Hollow. There is sanctuary here for any vampire and their beloved who understand that love is worth the price of darkness." Young Evangeline left the sanctuary that night, bearing a letter sealed with the covenant ring's mark, a symbol that would mean safety to any vampire who recognized it. And as she left, Evangeline felt the blood memory activate again, but this time it was showing her not the past, but the future. Another woman named Evangeline, bearing another covenant ring, building another sanctuary in another city, and another, an eternal procession of Evangelines, stretching into the future as far back as they stretched into the past. The original Evangeline 1643, had been right. The covenant wasn't meant to end. It was meant to echo, to propagate, to transform the entire vampire world, generation by generation, woman by woman, through an infinite chain of choices made freely, knowingly, embracing both the darkness and the light. When Lysander woke at sunset, Evangeline told him what had happened, and she watched his expression transform from concern to wonder, to something like triumph, the expression of a man who had waited 400 years to see his curse transformed into blessing, and finally understood that it was real. "You know what this means," he whispered. "Yes," Evangeline replied. "The covenant will outlive us. It will outlive the progenitor. It will become something the vampire world can never fully control or destroy. It will be what every Evangeline of the future teaches every vampire she binds to. That immortality is worth living only if there is love to give it meaning." Lysander pulled her close, and Evangeline felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was what she had been born for, not just to love this man, but to become a symbol, an archetype, the living embodiment of the idea that darkness could be transcended through devotion. The mute girl had drawn a picture of a man no one else could see, and now that picture was multiplying across centuries, manifesting in every sanctuary, in every covenant, in every woman brave enough to choose eternal darkness for the sake of immortal love. The midnight bells tolled across the sanctuary, and in the darkness beneath Raven's Hollow, the echo became a symphony. The hunt had ended. The love story had only just begun.